So it's my pleasure to welcome David Abel today. He's a research scientist at DeepMind. He's also honorary lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and he will be talking about the work that he's done more recently on researching the bedrock of agency, right? What underlies that. So thank you very much for coming today.
Cool. Thank you so much, Daniel. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for coming, everybody. This project was joint with a lot of people over a number of years. So just highlight all my wonderful collaborators here, mostly across DeepMind, and then Mike Bowling is at Alberta. So the question that really kickstarted this work was trying to think about what the essential properties of agents might be. And what I mean by this is that when we look to the other sciences, we have kind of a natural collection of such properties. We might consider something like a free body diagram involving a little ramp and a box that slides down this ramp. And in asking questions about what happens as we kind of unfreeze time, we can invoke various properties of this system. So like the height of the ramp, perhaps things like gravitational force, the friction, and these key ingredients can help us in both posing the right questions about this system, but also answering those questions. We can frame them in terms of something like explanatory laws, and eventually, hopefully, predictions that we know what will happen with this block before we ever kind of unfreeze time. When we look at, say, agents, both across the biological realm and within artificial, so say robots, chatbots, these kinds of things, my claim is we don't really have that same notion of those bedrock characteristics. The main way we scrutinize our agents right now is by putting them into a wide variety of settings. So maybe Atari 57 is one case, and then we might scrutinize the fact that a particular agent fails on a certain kind of problem, and we might try to unpack why does it fail on this kind of problem as opposed to this one? And of course, we've probably seen many learning curves that evaluate, say, the performance of agents across tasks like this as one way of getting a signal about the sort of salient characteristics about our agents. One other view into agents comes from something like the behavior suite from Ian Osmond and colleagues, where they propose this kind of spiderweb plot that gives you a qualitative look at the different features of an agent, broken down into things like memory, credit assignment, exploration, tolerance to noise. But realistically, if you unpack each of these axes, what they're really doing is giving the agent a bunch of credit assignment tasks, again, and then asking how well does it do on those tasks, or giving the agent a bunch of exploration tasks like multi-armed bandits and asking how well does it do on multi-armed bandits. So we're relying on our tasks and our benchmarks to tell us something about our agents. They're these sort of petri dishes, rather than knowing the kind of inherent properties and characteristics of the agents themselves. So that's the framing. When we look out at the natural world and we pick out something like a rock, we know maybe the mass, the energy, the force, velocity. These are kind of the core characteristics that comprise, say, material objects. But when we look at something like the caterpillar, we don't really know the analogous set of properties to even be asking about that should be kind of the ingredients of our theories about agents. So that's where these two terms of plasticity and empowerment can enter the picture. Now, both terms have been around a number of communities for a long time. What we're going to do today is bring them into the fold to model them using kind of the tools of reinforcement learning and ask, what is the relationship between these two things? And what can we do to make predictions about our agents using plasticity and empowerment as this kind of language for such predictions and theories? So what are plasticity and empowerment? Well, empowerment refers to how much power or control an agent has in its observable world. So in the case of a caterpillar, we can look at all the affordances of the caterpillar, the kinds of things it can do in its environment. So it can, say, climb up a flower, it can eat a leaf, it might transform into a butterfly, which gives it further empowerment to then, say, fly over a river or fly up a tree. And the total amount of things that the agent can do is the agent's empowerment. This was first defined by Kleubin and colleagues in 2005 as how much control or influence an agent has over its observable environment. And where we'll end up with Kleubin's definition is a function that takes as input an input-output system, so something like a rock or the caterpillar. And if we get this function right, we would hope that this function tells us that the empowerment of a rock is less than that of a caterpillar, that we're picking up on kind of the salient fact that caterpillars can do things in their environment, whereas rocks are inert. Now, plasticity, on the other hand, refers to the ways in which the caterpillar can respond or adapt to its environment. It's a measure of how much it can adapt. So for instance, if the caterpillar were to see a fire or a predator, the caterpillar might change its behavior, it might update its beliefs, it might imprint something in its memories that influences how it acts in the future. So plasticity has been studied across neuroscience under the term of synaptic plasticity, but also biology. And more recently within machine learning and reinforcement learning, the definition we use comes from Carpenter and Grossberg, which is roughly that plasticity is a capacity to remain adaptive. So to what extent can our caterpillar continue to respond to salient events in its environment? And again, where we'll try to end up is to define plasticity as a function that takes as input some input-output system like a rock or a caterpillar. And again, we would hope if we get the definition right, rocks should probably be less plastic than caterpillars. Okay, so where that takes up, I might just pause there actually if there are any questions or maybe challenges so far. Happy to take anything. Yeah, please.
I wonder, is this real, like, is this subject to environment? Let's say, if, I'm particularly good at studying one environment, but less good, so I can see why function will be like, in certain environments is greater than this, but then the other way around. It's subject to environments.
Great question. Yes. So to repeat that for folks online, are plasticity empowerment relative to an environment? Absolutely. And the definitions of both quantities will take as input an environment or a set of environments, exactly as you said. Yeah. Oh yeah, here and then here. Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah, I'm curious whether, like, I mean, intuitively, I would think that plasticity itself also then directly depends on empowerment. Because like I know like how like the rock in the thing that it does, right? It doesn't require to change its behavior at all because it just can continue being a rock. So it would have, if it wasn't dependent on empowerment, maximum plasticity, no? Well,
great question.
Always an optimal policy for the rock to be a rock.
Whoa. Yeah, let's see. The relationship between plasticity and empowerment is going to be a really important thread throughout here. And you're absolutely right. There is something important about that relationship. And in some cases, by having more of one quantity, you can ensure you have more of the other. So we'll come back to this thread throughout the talk, especially with the main results. Alex, yeah.
So
Okay.
Sort of similar to Fred's question. So you choose plasticity empowerment. I assume you'll justify this in a bit. But compared to mass energy, is the goal that there should be some sort of equivalence between these? Or is the goal that together these should span a large range of descriptions, such that they're like sufficient and minimal ways of describing most interesting agentic phenomena?
I would say more the latter. Yeah, we're looking for what are the almost universal properties of agents that can factor into our theories that let us both explain different kind of agentic phenomena, but then also make new predictions about what the agents can or cannot do.
And then the second question I have is, I mean, you'll probably discuss this, but it's you mentioned affordances earlier. With affordances, I get the impression that an affordance is somewhat decoupled from the agent's ability to perceive its environment. So another way things would be like, for the sake of empowerment, it would be great if you could just improve your ability to perceive the environment, because you may discover new affordances in doing so. And so like a paperclip maximizer, you can imagine an agent will always just want to improve its ability to perceive everything that's going on around it. But then this is not like static anymore. Like this is, when you say you give it an environment, are you saying you give it an environment conditional on how it perceives the environment, or are you always just going to assume like fully observable?
Oh, yeah, that's a deep question, definitely. So what we're going to do is choose what we take to be a very general class of environments. So it's going to be something like infinite state POM-DPs. The only restriction we'll make is that the space of observations is finite, but time can be infinite. So in that sense, we have to fix our interface between the agent and the environment. Like what are the agent's action signals and what are the observation signals? Subject to that assumption, then the environment can be arbitrarily rich. So in that sense, it can evolve. What the agent can extract from any given observation can evolve over time. What kinds of observations the agent sees can evolve over time. Maybe as the agent can jump, it can reach a new shelf, and then the observations become richer. So it is contained within here, but maybe not forefronted. Yeah, good question though. Awesome. Okay, so this is going to take us to our classic reinforcement learning loop between agent and environment, where they're just exchanging action and observation. The caveat is that there is no reward at the moment. You can think about this as being a piece of the observation, but throughout the talk, we're basically going to move past reward, or at least be agnostic to it for the time being, and then kind of reintroduce goals at a later time. So what empowerment and plasticity end up looking like are these two kinds of influence in this environment, in this diagram. So the first is how much do the actions influence observations? That's empowerment. And the second is how much do observations influence actions? And that's going to be plasticity, roughly. And these we take to be these kind of two fundamental capacities of an agent. One is the capacity to adapt, to kind of extract something meaningful from its observations to inform action. And the second is the capacity to control. How much can it steer its future observations? And the main result that we'll build to, that comes back to the question before, is that every agent in every environment, subject to this assumption about finite actions and observation spaces, will actually face a tension between plasticity and empowerment. So to be a little more precise about that, and then we'll come back to the details near the end. That no agent can ever realize. So one way to look at that is if an agent's maximally plastic, it has to have zero empowerment. And if an agent's maximally empowered, it has to have zero plasticity. And the intuition for this is that agents that fully control their worlds can't also be surprised by them. If you're getting to shape everything around you, you can't learn. So we'll come back to this result. This is the result I'm kind of most excited about within this work. I think this has some kind of fun new threads to explore. But just at a high level, the example to have in mind is imagine you're in a band, say you're the violin player. So we'll take the egocentric perspective where the agent is playing violin. And in this case, the exchange of action and observations are these musical notes that you're playing. So you play some notes on the violin, and then you hear your bandmates on guitar and piano play some notes from their instruments, and that's your observation. Now, empowerment is how much is what you're playing shaping your companions? How much are they responding and listening to what you're playing? And then plasticity is how much is what they're playing influencing what you play. And you can imagine you probably want to play with bandmates that have some plasticity. If they don't, they're just going to ignore you and they'll just, keep playing Wonderwall in the corner or something like that. So the ideal kind of collection to collaborate is probably a case where every agent in the mix has a little bit of plasticity and a little bit of empowerment. And this kind of Goldilocks zone is something we'll come back to throughout the talk as well. Yeah, Alex.
Let's do a question to clarify. So the way you just described empowerment makes it sound like an empowered agent is one whose actions at time t can lead to the greatest range of possible observations at time t plus one. But what I thought empowerment is an agent whose range of possible actions at time t plus one to infinity is the greatest. So which of these two is what are you going for?
Great question. We'll mostly talk about the finite horizon case. It won't just be one time step. You get to pick the windows that you care about. We'll come back to this. This was
allowing yourself to take a greater set of future actions, or allowing yourself to influence the environment to a greater extent?
Influence the environment.
Okay.
Yeah, influence, exactly. Yeah, great question. So this is really the main result, the presence of this tension between these two quantities. And we'll come back to this throughout the talk. Just to summarize before we dive into some of the technical details, we really take these two properties of plasticity and empowerment to be sort of the arguably maybe necessary characteristics of agency. There's a few people in the project that have been arguing that anything without both of these is not an agent. So if it has zero of both, has no influence in either direction, it's probably not an agent. So we think these are useful characteristics of an agent. And the second is that we're going to present a formalism for both plasticity and empowerment using the language of information in order to ground these. This is arguably just one language for kind of telling this story about plasticity and empowerment. While I think it's a useful language for telling this story, my hunch is that the precise tools we use to ground these concepts so far maybe isn't so important. But that being said, I think information tells this story quite nicely, so we'll stick with that. And those two claims together give us this tension between plasticity and empowerment. Okay, so with that, let's dive into some of the formalism. So this will be very familiar to a lot of you, but there's a few twists we're making to the usual reinforcement learning setup. So I just want to put that on the table in front of us today. So our starting point, as I mentioned, is we just have actions and observations. So this is really coming from Sutton's, what he calls the buttons and lights view, that the mind is separated by an interface of possible buttons, the observations, or sorry, actions, and lights, the observations. Goals will not appear throughout the talk, aside from basically this slide. There is a way to accommodate this, but for now, we're just talking about influence. So there's no sense of influence toward a goal or with intent or something like that. All information is created equal, in other words. So with that, we have a few ingredients that are going to be a lot like our usual kind of MDP and POMDP, but we'll just make a few little twists. So we start from this thing we call an interface, which is the set of actions A and the set of observations O. These together give us what we call the space of histories, which are just the sequences of possible interactions between an agent and environment that share an interface. So this is going to be a button press, then a light, then buttons, and so on. This forms a single sequence of interaction. This can be of arbitrary length. Our agent and environment are just functions of history. So this is like a history-based policy, and we're using this delta here to denote the simplex over the set A. So this is a probabilistic function from any length history to a choice of action. Similarly, our environment is also going to be a similar function. So it's again a function from history plus the agent's last action. We assume the agent acts first to a distribution over observations. And so the agent and environment will just exchange actions and observations in our usual way. The subtlety is that because these can depend on history, the past doesn't necessarily constrain the future. So the environment can be sort of implicitly non-stationary. It can continue to change behind the hood, and we can continue to see new observations over the agent's lifetime. And similarly, this definition of an agent bakes in the learning process because it's a function of history. So it could be adapting over many, many experiences to change how it selects its actions. We'll use the big lambda to refer to a set of agents. It's just any collection of these history-based policies. And then we use the subscript notation of 1 to n to refer to a sequence of discrete random variables. So in this case, the sequence of actions from time step 1 up to time step n. So that's all for our kind of agent and environment notation. Any questions on this before I move on? Perfect. Okay, so this gives us our agent environment picture. This will create these histories, again, of length n, action, observation, and so on. With that, we're in a position to define empowerment. So again, we asked for this function that takes as input something, an input-output system. Now we can just replace that input-output system with these different lambdas that correspond to these different history-based policies. And again, Klyubin et al. In 2005 were the first to propose this definition of empowerment. I think this is like a beautiful paper, and this whole line of work from Polanyi's group has been pushing on this since about 2005. The main idea, as I kind of hinted at early on, is to use information as the notion of empowerment. So we'll use K empowerment to refer to Klyubin's definition of empowerment, which we'll make a few tweaks to. And we're looking at the empowerment of a single agent in a single environment. So coming back to the question in the back, this is relative to one environment, is the mutual information between the sequence of n actions the agent takes, and then the observation that comes immediately after. And there's a few other pieces to this, but just to dig into the mutual information part first, this is saying if the agent took this sequence of actions that's non-reactive, right? So the agent's just pre-committing to a set of actions, like these button presses, what is the observation that occurs at the end, and how much information do they share? So if they share no information, then the agent's actions kind of are not shaping that observation at all. In this sense, the environment is sort of not listening to the agent, and so the agent has no empowerment. There's a few other pieces to this. So in order to enrich this definition, the original Klyubin et al. View defines this relative to a choice of other agents, so policies, effectively. These are the choices that the agent could make. So by taking this max, it's effectively becoming a channel capacity, but the intuition is the agent can select any of these different distributions over this sequence of n random variables, and that distribution corresponds to the agent's choice. And their proposal is to treat that as the empowerment of the agent. And they'll use this little math frac E, the Old English E, will subscript with K to give this the Klyubin definition of empowerment. So this is relative to this particular choice, and this is effectively the set of open loop policies. So they cannot react over time to the new observations along the way. So there's a couple things that are good about this definition, but there's a couple things that are limited. So the main limitation to me that jumps out is that this choice of what policies the agent can choose from has to be the open loop policies. So it's only the sort of non-reactive policies. So this is a limitation. And in order to go beyond this limitation, in 2011, Captipoy proposed an enrichment of this using this concept called directed information. So now we'll take a brief detour through directed information. I think this is just a really fun kind of set of tools for thinking about influence in general. So we'll just do a quick walkthrough of this. And the premise is to take Shannon's original setup. So we have Alice communicating with Bob. Alice sends some discrete random variable x through a noisy channel. Bob attempts to reconstruct it as x hat. And the kind of celebrated result from Shannon, at least one of them, is this channel capacity theorem that says the amount that they can communicate is defined by this supremum over this mutual information term. So this is really where this empowerment definition draws inspiration. Now, in the 70s, this researcher Marco noted that there's a limitation to Shannon's view, which is that Alice can only send messages to Bob. And Marco asked, I think, a really fascinating question. What happens if Bob can actually also send messages back to Alice? And we'll just kind of simplify this picture a little bit and get rid of the noisy channels. Alice sends X to Bob, which then influences Bob to send Y back to Alice. And then Alice can then, having seen Y, send X back to Bob, and so on. And you'll notice if we just rotate this diagram 90 degrees, we recover our agent environment loop. So that's really going to be the main sort of sleight of hand throughout the talk. We're using this bidirectional communication theory from Marco to talk about agent environment as a communication game, where the agent gets to communicate to the environment by sending an action, and the environment communicates to the agent by sending an observation. And one of the really cool observations within Marco's theory comes from Massey, which showed that rather than have a single information term, there are now two information terms. The first is how much does X influence Bob when choosing Y? And the second is how much does Y influence Alice in choosing X? And that's this other information term. And you'll notice these end up looking a lot like plasticity and empowerment, and that's roughly where we're going with this. You'll notice too, we can extend this to sequences of random variables. So this definition of what we'll call directed information can span over arbitrary sequences of some length n. I'll put the definition of directed information up, but the details maybe aren't so important. Again, this comes from Massey in the 90s, so almost 20 years after Marco's original paper. We'll use this arrow to denote directed information, and it's always defined relative to sequences of length n. And what you get is a sum of conditional mutual information terms that are very similar to just the chain rule of mutual information. Just to build some intuition for this, the idea is if we have this sequence of n discrete random variables, X coming from Alice to Bob, and then Y going from Bob to Alice, the directed information asks, how much does the past X influence the future Y? So how much does X1 influence Y1, X1 and X2 influence Y2, given that you already know Y1? And in general, how much do all the past X's influence the future Ys? And that's what this directed information quantity gives us. So in general, we get this picture of X's influencing future Ys. That's directed information at a high level. Now, a really cool fact of directed information, again, comes from Massey and Massey. It's called the conservation law of directed information. It has to do with those two different information terms we saw a moment ago. And what they proved is that the mutual information between all of the messages sent between Alice and Bob can be decomposed into those two different mutual information, directed information terms. So when we look at this picture, this green arrow and this pink arrow completely describe the information between Alice and Bob, and there's no overlap. So all of the information contained in these is independent. And that's the real power, I think, of this framing. It's a way to sort of sort out the root causes of who's influencing who. I'll note this isn't strictly causal. The closest you can get is Granger causality. But that being said, this directed information lets us distinguish between these two kinds of influence.
You say it's the directed information on Bob's output value inputs from Alice's side and then vice versa.
That's right.
So what do you, when you say independent?
It means we won't double count information. Yeah, that's all. Not independent in a statistical sense. Yeah. So what the theorem shows is that the mutual information between these two sequences of length n random variables is just equal to these two sums of these two directed information terms. And we're using this hook arrow as, again, a little small sleight of hand to get rid of kind of fence post issues, kind of off by one errors. But it's sort of a small modeling detail, and the details aren't so crucial. Okay, any questions on directed information before we move forward? Cool. And any questions online? I want to make sure folks have some intuition for this. We're feeling good. Okay, amazing. So using directed information, we can then revisit this notion of K empowerment and go to something beyond the open loop agents, because now the agents are allowed to react along over time, and we'll be able to pick up the influence of observations, of actions on observations over an extended period. So in 2011, Kaptopoi proposed in their thesis what we'll call C empowerment for Kaptopoi, which is again, the max of this directed information term. How much do the agent's N actions influence the next O observations? So now we're allowed to enrich this to cover a arbitrary agent set. We can define this relative to any choice of policies. However, there's one lingering restriction, which comes back to Alex's question from before about the finite versus infinite window. So right now, we're always looking at the same exact sequence from 1 to n, and we always have to start from the beginning of time. So we make one final change, which is a thing we call generalized directed information. So it's a way of enriching. Oh yeah, question.
Why can't you just give the agent like a null action? I don't think I fully understood the previous restriction there. Like if the actions
Mm-hmm.
you have mismatch in the range.
So yeah, this is a way to get around indexing at the beginning. Like if you wanted to pad like null bits at the start of time or something like this.
But maybe that's janky because it's still doing this. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. This is effectively what Massey did though. So in the original Massey paper, they have null bits that they add. There's some limitations to it. Yeah. So we're gonna. Oh, sure.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? This is Jorge. Can David repeat the questions each time that somebody asks a question from the room?
Yes, I can do
Okay,
that.
thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, I realized I did that for the first question, but none since. So I'll try to remember to do that. Thanks, Jorge. Great. Okay, so I'll just do a kind of whirlwind tour through this quantity, and then we'll go back to plasticity empowerment. The main premise of generalized directed information, or GDI, is that we just want to extend directed information as a quantity so that we can move those intervals however we want. So if directed information looks like this, 1 to n to 1 to n, the GDI is going to look like this. We get to pick some starting indices, a to b, and some ending indices, c to d, and we get to move them around. So what that can look like, the two intervals could overlap a little bit. They could overlap this way. Y can come fully after x, x can come fully after y. We can just move these around arbitrarily. And this just gives us more modeling power to talk about influence over different lengths of time. And we no longer have to start at the beginning of time. There's a few advantages. And of course, we generalize directed information because you can just set a, b, c, d to be 1 and n.
What's the intuition from the retro-causal looking one?
Oh, like this one? Yeah, great question. So we'll actually show, let me see. Do I have another? Did I not include? Okay, imagine that arrow is going that way. So y is going back to x. What we'll show is that the GDI is just always 0 in those cases. In cases like this, all you'll get is that these x's can influence the y's that come after it. Yeah, as you'd expect. Yeah. Oh, sorry. The question was intuition for the retrocausal cases. I apologize on mine. Yeah, I will try to remember. I'm very forgetful. Great. So I'll put the definition up. Again, the details maybe aren't so crucial. It's effectively the directed information, but we just have to replace some indices with some max and mins, and then we have some conditioning. These are just well chosen so that all the properties we've talked about so far end up working out. And what ends up being true of this GDI is a couple different facts that we'll need in our analysis of plasticity and empowerment. So the first is the natural thing that previous definition just strictly generalizes the original directed information. If you set the indices to be 1 and n, that you perfectly recover directed information. So we're not losing anything by moving to the GDI. The second thing is what we'll call temporal consistency. This comes back to Alex's question. If y comes before x, then this quantity is 0, as we might hope. It's just sort of a sanity check to make sure we've gotten the definition right. The main result, there's really two main results about GDI. One is a data processing inequality that we won't really need, so I'm not going to go through it. But the other is a conservation law. So this generalizes Massey and Massey's result now for the GDI. So for any choice of indices A, B, C, D, you recover the same notion that these two GDI terms can be decomposed into, in this case, a conditional mutual information term. You might wonder, why is this conditional? Why are we conditioning on these weird things at the beginning? Some intuition. One is that if you set A and C to 1, the definition of our notation is that these two terms just drop out. They don't actually mean anything, so you recover exactly the original conservation law. The second is that it's in a way removing confounders. It's not quite this, because again, it's not fully causal, but you can imagine maybe there's a red light in X that's fully determining a lot about this relationship. You just need to remove that influence in order to recover how much are these actual variables from A to B influencing C to D, rather than that red light from the beginning of time. So using GDI, we can now come back to the C empowerment and go beyond this fixed equal length to define empowerment in this way. So a few things to comment on. First, we get this kind of slightly messy notation of A, B, C, D. So now it's relative to our choice of indices. We've been looking at a limiting version of this. That's just the average rate of information influence of this kind. There's some, I think, fun threads there, but I will not talk about that much today. Things to point out, we now have this arbitrary choice of agent set. So what policies count as choice for the agent? And we can use arbitrary sequences. So we get to pick what do we want to measure when we talk about different slices of time. And as a special case, you might notice that when you set A and B to 1 to n and C to D to 1 to n, you just fully recover a cap Dupuis case. And when you set the policy class to be the open loop policies, you just recover a Clausen's case. So this again just purely generalizes the existing two definitions of empowerment. So we're not giving anything up by going to this definition. Lastly, the main definition we'll operate with is of the single agent case. So notice if you set that choice of policies just to a single agent, this is moving choice from which policy is the agent selecting to the randomness inherent to the agent, corresponding to when does the agent make new information. So it's just a different way of understanding choice in the context of information theory. The definition is just, if we select the previous definition with a singleton set, you get exactly this. So this is the definition of empowerment that we'll move forward with. But notice that it's still relative to an environment. I'm just going to obscure it there for brevity, but there's always an environment in the picture. We can also incorporate a set of environments. There's a whole story there, but I'll leave that for now. Okay, so coming back, we wanted this definition of empowerment. We now have this definition E that can take as input these different lambdas, and we can ask questions about it relative to different intervals of time. So the hope would be, subject to how we might interpret inputs and outputs to a rock, and depending on our choice of indices, we should probably recover this fact that the empowerment of a rock is less than that of a caterpillar. But I haven't said anything about plasticity yet. So reminder, this is the other source of influence. How much can the agent be influenced by the environment? Carpenter and Grossberg say capacity to remain adaptive. And we said we also wanted a function for plasticity of rock. And I've kind of set up the pieces. It might be clear what I'm about to do, but we have these two sources of influence in the directed information picture. So when we ask, what should this function of plasticity be? The answer is going to be, well, it's this second source of influence, plasticity. We'll define this as, just sticking with Clausen's notation, we'll use the Old English P of a lambda, which gives us the influence of observations to actions. You might wonder why we're using actions rather than something kind of internal to the agent. Like how much did the observations influence the agent's parameters or its weights or its memories? There's a version of this as well with the random variable agent state rather than A. And most things work out quite nicely there too. We still have to play with some details, but the simplest version is just in terms of observation and action. So what we end up with is this picture of these two kinds of influence, so empowerment on the top, plasticity on the bottom, that correspond roughly to necessary conditions for something like control and something like learning. Maybe not sufficient on their own, but they seem to point to a picture of something like necessity, right? If an agent's never changing its actions in light of observations, it's arguably not learning. Okay, so now we'll come back to our example of the musician, right? So if we take the egocentric view of this violin player emitting notes and listening to notes, the empowerment again is how much do how much information is the violin player sending to its other players by playing certain notes. And plasticity is how much information is being sent through the violin player from the notes they hear to their actions. So for instance, a violin player that whatever notes they hear, they just mirror back will have very high plasticity. And again, a violin player that ignores the inputs entirely will have zero plasticity. So this brings us to this main result, this tension that I promised at the beginning. So here on the x-axis, we're picturing the feasible plasticities that an agent can realize. And on the y-axis, we're looking at the feasible empowerments. And again, there's this region that no agent can ever realize. I'll put the theorem up in full detail. It's a little messy, there's a lot of symbols, but a couple things to point out. First, it depends on this choice of A, B, and C, D. So we're looking at two specific intervals. How much do these actions influence these observations? What this does not mean is that there's a cap on the agent's plasticity empowerment over its lifetime. We don't yet know what happens over the course of an agent's lifetime, but you could imagine, similar to say explore, exploit, maybe the agent has to explore for a while, then exploit, then explore, then exploit. We speculate that plasticity and empowerment have a similar flavor, that maybe it's valuable to be empowered to kind of take an agent to areas of high information. Like go take me to the 10 greatest libraries in the world, and then I'm going to be very plastic and kind of soak up all the information in those libraries. But if you're not empowered to begin with, maybe you can't get to those libraries. You have no opportunity to benefit from the plasticity at all. Final thing to point out about this result, I mentioned this at the very beginning, but now that we have it in front of us, this upper bound is actually tight. So what you'll find is cases where you can max that plasticity term, and so the empowerment has to be 0. So we've shown there's cases where P is M, and thus empowerment has to be 0. We've shown there's cases where E is M, and so plasticity has to be 0. So this is the force of the tension. So we've just run a couple little experiments as sort of a sanity check of the theory. On the x-axis, we'll look at epsilon as in epsilon greedy for something like Q-learning. And on the y-axis, we're going to look at plasticity. So what this ends up looking like, if epsilon is 0, it means that the agent's actions are purely coming from the greedy policy. And so that greedy policy is fully shaped by, well, something like the prior, the initial Q function, but then the data that it's seen. What actions would lead to reward based on what I've seen so far? That's what happens when epsilon is 0, so we see some plasticity because the policy is determined by the data. But as epsilon increases, you're kind of turning off the amount of influence from the past data and just allowing more randomness through. So when epsilon is 1, there's no greedy policy anymore. The data have no effect on the agent's policy, and so you recover 0 plasticity. Cool. Any questions on this?
How are you measuring plasticity?
So this is with that GDI term. Yeah, exactly. We just have like a Monte Carlo estimate of this. It's a little sloppy, to be honest. Yeah.
I think maybe Jorge wants the question repeated.
Thank you, Jorge. I'm sorry. Yes.
I have a question
Yes,
about
the question was, how are we measuring the plasticity in this plot? And my answer was that we're just using this GDI term, and we're using a Monte Carlo estimate to compute it. So we have like entropy estimators, and we use that to compute the GDI.
Sorry, just a question
I also have a question.
before, so the intervals remains fixed. That's why it's the lifetime of the agent, the A, B, and C.
Good question. So the question was, do the intervals remain fixed throughout the lifetime of the agent? They will not, but the theorem will only apply for a fixed choice of intervals. So for any intervals we select, the theorem applies. But if you change the intervals, you might recover a different degree of plasticity and different degree of empowerment. And the upper bound depends on the magnitude of B and A and C and D. And so if you picked a really small interval, you're kind of capping how much influence can occur. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question, David. So you in this theorem, you it depends on the size of the actions, the actions that you have. So is this fixed? So what happens if I learn new actions? My actions are going to be finite all the time, but I can have new actions. Does it apply the same theorem?
Great question. So two ways to think about this. One is that at the moment we've defined that interface to be fixed. So the agent's action space is given at the dawn of time, and it has to remain as such until the end of time.
And it has,
Similarly for the observations.
has to
And
be,
so in that sense, you might think, well, no, we can't accommodate sort of changing action and
and it has
observation
to be,
spaces. Maybe one
has to be
other way we could, I think, accommodate this, I don't think this should be problematic, is to define that action space as a function of time or as a function of history, so that as long as it remains finite, the agent at any time step just has to choose from the available actions. So it might just have, there's a master action set of all possible actions the agent can ever take over any history. And then at any given point in time, that action set is filtered to sort of the available action, sort of like options within an initiation set, something like that. And in that case, I'm pretty sure you'll recover the same result, but rather than that log A, log O, you'll get log like available actions, available observations. But I haven't worked that out carefully, so there might be some gotchas, but I don't see any immediately. Yeah, thanks, Jorge. Great question. Anything else? Did that answer your question?
yeah, so I was thinking about I can write programs each time that I see I see the environment and I have a problem, I can write a new program to solve my problem. So this will increase my number of actions all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. Oh, wait.
But it has
Thanks.
to be fine.
Great point. And I think that should be accommodated by this case where that action space depends on the history. So as an example, if the agent is doing some specific thing, then it unlocks the other regions of the action space later on. But we just haven't gone through the work of kind of making sure that that story fits under this, but I'm pretty sure it should, as long as that action space, the sort of master action space, is always finite. And maybe just to speculate, even if it's not, I think the limiting, like the average rate of these quantities will still induce attention. But again, just speculating. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Jorge. Yeah, great question. So, okay, one more experiment. And again, very simple case. Here we're looking at optimism and pessimism. And we're looking at, again, plasticity, empowerment, and then there's some. So blue is plasticity down here. Orange is empowerment, and then P plus E is their sum in green. And the dashed line above is the upper bound from the theorem. And what we're seeing is that as we vary, in this case, the value function's initialization, so on the left, the agent is pessimistic, and on the right, it's optimistic, and in the very middle, it's neutral. Empowerment actually increases noticeably as the agent becomes more optimistic. And this is an agent that's optimistic is actively trying to explore. It's trying to bring about new things, right? There's this connection between optimism and novelty. And an agent that has more ability to bring about new things is more empowered. Whereas a pessimistic agent is sort of slightly afraid of trying out new things. And so it stays where it is more often than not. So I think this also somewhat, I didn't know this before running the experiment, to be honest. It's kind of a post hoc explanation. Okay, so now just to speculate on a couple implications and kind of fun threads that we're still playing with. No worries. No, of course.
If I initialize the value function as the same value everywhere, my updates always have the same magnitude. It's not basically why anything is changing. Because I'm always going to take out.
Okay, so the question was, if you initialize your value function the same thing everywhere.
So it's like a Russian, it might be very depressed, but he's still doing stuff. But everything he does, he's like, oh, I don't really want to do this. Whereas like an American loves doing anything. In a sense, they both might take the same actions because like the relative difference is well. So I don't know why there's I don't understand why there's a difference in behavior here, provided that the action is only ever the function of the difference in that between two states. So it must be.
Okay, great. So the question, I'll try to summarize pieces of that. Like basically, why are we seeing this difference between pessimism and optimism? It's a Q value initialization. And so I think this might answer that the certain actions are viewed as just a bad idea. So if you're given, say, I think there's 6 actions in this environment. If all 6 actions you're pessimistic about, the first action you take, if it has some positive reward that's better, and because it's pessimistic, you'll find that better action pretty quickly, you'll just stop trying everything else. And so the agent that's not trying anything else, and it's just exploiting the one action that it likes, it can only really bring about one possibility. whereas the agent that's trying all of its actions can bring about more outcomes.
Sure. So it's because you're capping at one. Is that why? Because
Capping what it-
and I took an action, and then I was like, oh, this happened to be good, and then it would now be like 1.1. I feel like the same thing could happen, provided you're doing like greedy sample.
So the question was, my response before, is it because we're capping I think the value at 1, is that right?
For example.
Yeah, let's see. So eventually,
Because the
that-
still just always take the pain or whatever.
yes, someone that's perpetually optimistic will continue trying things and continue bringing about new outcomes. I haven't run this, but this gives me a suggestion for an experiment, which is nice. So thank you for that, which is to look at how this changes over time. So right now, this is for the first maybe 20 steps of learning. And so you can imagine if we fast forwarded 1,000 time steps in the future, we would see this optimism diminish as well, because the agent is no longer exploring as much. If we, I think we use the just epsilon greedy again here alongside the value. The agent that stops exploring, I think, will lose empowerment. Yeah, let's talk more offline though. I think there's more to dig into there. Yeah, thanks, Alex. Okay, how are we doing on time? Got like
Still go bad.
okay.
We started a bit late, so you can.
No worries. I would love to get to Q&A and discussion and whatnot. So I'll highlight a couple directions I'm excited about, and then we can move forward. So one thing that comes from this tension that we've pointed out is the existence of something like a Goldilocks zone of plasticity and empowerment. So we've shown separately that there are minimum plasticity values that you need in order to be optimal in some environments. And similarly, we've shown there's maximal empowerment values that you need in order to be optimal, all the way around. So we end up with these little Goldilocks zones that are tailored to the environment and the reward. So it depends on the specific environment, but these bands always exist somewhat trivially just because the bands could just be the full range. But in a lot of cases, they're going to be somewhere in the middle. And as a framing, I tend to think about this as creating agents that have to balance between their plasticity and empowerment. Again, coming back to the music example, in playing music with somebody, you probably don't want someone that has no plasticity because they'll just ignore you. But you also don't want necessarily someone that has no empowerment because they're not kind of bringing any of their new, whatever, creativity, imagination to the picture and allowing you all to create something new together. So in thinking about human-machine teaming, social dilemmas, cooperative settings, we think that better understanding this Goldilocks zone could be really powerful framing for thinking about designing kind of fun agents, safe agents, creative agents, reliable agents, these kinds of things. In order to get there, I think we need some new algorithmic tools for modulating plasticity and empowerment. And we showed in those little experiments that maybe things like epsilon or optimism are one way of controlling them. But I think we need more direct knobs and more direct ways of designing agents that can kind of carve out the right levels of plasticity and empowerment. I mentioned social dilemmas briefly. I'm quite optimistic about this as a lens for things like game theory, multi-agent RL, and social dilemmas. So if you had a team of agents all trying to build a house, there's probably something that needs to be true of that team in terms of their plasticity and empowerment in order to successfully build the house, right? If every agent here has zero plasticity, I can basically guarantee you that house is going to be miserable. They're all ignoring each other. Maybe we've been a part of such teams in the past. And so what do we need? Well, we might need a balance of some kind, right? It's not clear what the dynamics need to look like across a team. Maybe one agent is really empowered. Maybe they're all equally empowered. Maybe one thing we might want is that our AI assistants that we're developing kind of respect the empowerment of the people that they're involved with. So they're not kind of disempowering people through their interactions. We want our machines to empower us, not disempower us, right? A final kind of speculative claim that, again, some people on the project have mentioned, and I'll probably propose a 45-degree rotation to that plus, that some combination of plasticity and empowerment might be a definition of agency. There's been many such definitions of agency in the past, but this gives us two measurable quantities that can actually ground a potential measure of agency as well. I promised that we wouldn't talk about goals very much, but of course goals are essential to our picture of agents. It's kind of the lifeblood of an agent in a way. There's this beautiful paper by Philip Ball on agents within the context of biology. And Ball says an agent does more than just alter its environment, so that's empowerment. It alters with intent. And that intent is the goal, right? We're missing that picture of goal here. So just one speculative thought on how to mix goals in here. We can treat our observations as a vector with one special element, the reward, and we can look at plasticity in terms of how much does the reward shape the agent's behavior, and vice versa with empowerment.
Is that different from, let's say, multiplying the observation by scale or something? Like in your earlier equation, we have like A to B observation, you can just R, A to B times observation A to B. Like there are certain actions you took where you cared more about the observation, essentially being.
Yeah. So the question was, is this different from kind of multiplying R, weighting observations?
Yeah.
Can reward equivalently be thought of as weighting observations? Potentially. My personal thought is that the weight of an observation should depend on kind of the agent's internal ecosystem, and it should figure out for itself which observations matter and why. And the reward could be a arguably really important part of that, but maybe it's not the only part. Yeah. On that, I'm just gonna bang ahead to the end so we can have some questions. So huge, okay, so we got the paper out. It's on archive if you want to take a look. I've got a link. Huge thank you to all my collaborators. As you can see, this was a really big project. So we had a lot of fun debating many aspects of this, and we disagreed along the way about so many things, but we all agreed about this final picture, I think at least. So it's a really fun project. Super grateful to everyone involved. And with that, I'll wrap up and go to questions. So thank you so much.
Very good.